I'm delighted that so many of you have joined us for the second annual Bantle Symposium in Business and Government Policy. I'm David Van Slyke. I'm the Associate Dean and the Department Chair of Public Administration and International Affairs here at the Maxwell School, and I also hold the Louis A. Bantle Chair in Business and Government Policy. The Bantle Chair was established by the late Louis F. Bantle in honor of his father, Louis A. Bantle, and I'm especially delighted and to welcome and honored to have here today Bobby Bantle with us, who is Lou Bantle's. And like his father, Bobby's been a wonderful supporter of Syracuse University and building support for research, teaching, and practice in promoting business-government relationships. Today's theme is talking about rethinking the government-business relationship. We need each other more than ever. As we look at many of the complex public policy challenges that confront government today, it's increasingly difficult to identify, develop, implement, and evaluate what those interventions should be, who they should be with, who the targeted beneficiaries are, how the program should work, and whether they're working at all. That difficulty is compounded in government at all levels, especially when it attempts to work on these issues independent of the many external experts with knowledge and expertise to share. But when government engages and works with private, for-profit firms, nonprofits, and other governments, there are more opportunities for information exchange and coordination, cooperation, and collaboration. However, there's no shortage of cliches about business being either an adversary of government or just this trusted partner of government. In point of fact, there are many times when governments and public administrators work closely with private partners and with success. But there are also instances when the public and private partners' goals diverge from one another, when the relationship is relatively immature, and when each pursues its own goals at the expense of the other. In many of the classes that we teach here at the Maxwell School and the research that we carry out, we talk of partnerships. But too often, those discussions lack the practical application born out of rich and multi-sectoral experiences. Many of the students in this room today are committed to public service, and their work can benefit governments, communities, nonprofits, and firms, regardless of where they're working and what type of firm or organization it is. Our speakers today are very experienced professionals that have worked in, with, and across the three sectors of the economy. And they've tackled and achieved very positive results on complex public policy programs through a commitment to public administration that is multi-sectoral, intergovernmental, and focused on long-term relationship building that's intended to benefit each party and the citizenry, ranging from fairly simple products and services in robust markets to truly complex products and services in fairly thin markets. In hearing from each of them today, we're going to gain a greater and more practical understanding of the experiences they've had, the analytical and managerial approaches they've used, and the practices they've put into place to facilitate success, avoid failure, and resolve conflict. So today's format, beyond my introduction, is to give each of our panelists approximately 15 minutes to speak. Then we'll have one or two kind of integrative softball questions for them to chew on before we get to your really difficult and challenging questions to make them earn their dinner. Finally, at the conclusion of our panel symposium, we'll move out to the Maxwell Eggers Foyer at 5 p.m. for a very nice reception that I hope you'll all join us for. Now, I'd like to tell you a few things about each of them. The first is Miss Anne Rung. Anne is a good friend and the current administrator for the Federal Procurement Policy, Office of Federal Procurement Policy. She's in the Office of Management and Budget in the Executive Office of the President and was confirmed to that position in July 2014. But prior to assuming that position, she's actually been in the federal government and in the Obama administration for the last 6.5 years, working 80 hours a week, working as the Chief Acquisition Officer and Senior Advisor over at the General Services Administration, and also as the Senior Director of Administration at the Department of Commerce. Before her federal service, Anne served for 7 years in a range of positions of increasing responsibility in the state of Pennsylvania, ultimately assuming the position of Deputy Secretary for Administration and Procurement in the Department of General Services. But as I promised, each of these people has worked in different sectors. So beyond working on the bureaucratic side, Ann's also worked on the congressional side, working for different Congress members and also working for congressional committees, including the Senate Judiciary Committee. And before that, starting out her career, she worked for a big government relations firm, Cassidy & Associates. So it would not be an exaggeration to say that Ann's had substantial administrative, procurement, and legislative experiences in which she's held a number of high-profile leadership jobs at the state and federal level. Her professional experience, though, ranging from the private to the public, has really prepared her for the range of opportunities she's had in her last 2 years serving the president directly. On any number of days and almost on a weekly basis, I find her name in a range of articles in kind of the professional space that she's in. I see her giving testimony, I see her giving presentations, and even within our own networks here at the Maxwell School, I hear her name repeatedly spoken about in terms of the energy and initiative that she's brought to that office. An office that in many cases is often seen as kind of a back office, technical, bureaucratic part of the Office of Management and Budget. She's brought a very different level of dynamism, and part of that dynamism has been how to build the relationships between industry and the government in a way that is actually mutually beneficial for both. So I wouldn't call her a convert. I'd say she has a healthy dose of skepticism about how to build those bridges, but that's been one of the things that she's worked on. And she's won any number of awards, many of them prestigious, including DC's Top 50 Women in Technology. She's been a recipient of the coveted Federal 100 Award from Federal Computer Week, and she's won a number of other awards, both from the Department of Commerce and other agencies, for her leadership. Ann holds a BA from Penn State and a master's from the London School of Economics. Our next speaker is Mr. Stan Soloway. Stan just recently stepped down after 15 years as the president and CEO of the Professional Services Council to start his own firm. Under Stan's leadership, he brought a level of activity that anyone who knows him would describe only as frenetic. 80-hour weeks are the kinds of things that Stan kind of scoffs at because he feels like you're not working hard enough. And in that time, he built the association membership by more than 300% and led a number of very high-profile and widely regarded acquisitions. Before assuming that post, Stan also served as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Reform during the second term of the Clinton administration. He's a frequent speaker on all topics related to government and public administration and leadership and acquisition and procurement reform. He's written widely, given testimony, and I've known Stan for about 8 years, and I would say that he's at the forefront of what I would call wearing 3 very different types of hats. His first hat is that while he's been in the government and now been out of the government for some time, he continues to think about the needs of the government from a senior government executive perspective. His second hat is that his members are firms, they're businesses, and they want to understand how do we engage the government and how do we develop healthy and productive long-term relationships that are mutually beneficial. The third hat is as an engaged citizen. And one of the things that Stan worries a lot about, and I'm thankful for, is efficient and effective spending of the government. Now, Stan is also controversial because he gets invited to speak in so many places, and because of his intellectual acuity and fortitude, Stan often says things that some of us think privately but would not have the kind of audacity to say publicly. Stan says most of those things publicly and more, and as a result gets invited to be a part of the work effort that's often involved. But he does that cheerfully and brings a lot of energy and intellectual attention. Like Ann, Stan has also won a number of awards, including the 2013 Industry Executive of the Year by Government Computer News, the Herbert Roback Award, the highest award from the National Contract Management Association. The Washington Business Journal named him to its Power 100 of the 100 most influential business leaders in Washington, D.C., and he's received the Federal 100 Award on 2 different occasions. His philanthropic and voluntary contributions and commitments are extensive, and I won't repeat all of them here, but he was a Senate-confirmed member of the Corporation for National and Community Service, is a principal of the Partnership for Public Service, and a member of the Executive Advisory Board of the National Contract Management Association. Stan holds a bachelor's degree from Denison University. And our last guest is Dr. Lloyd Blanchard. Lloyd is one of our own. He earned his MPA and his PhD in public administration here at the Maxwell School. His dissertation advisor, Professor Yinger, is sitting in the audience. And Lloyd is currently the Director of Finance and Monitoring Services at IEM, which is a global security consulting firm. And I find this really interesting. That is the largest women and minority-owned firm focused on emergency management and homeland security. Lloyd is also an employer of our MPAs, having hired several in the past couple of years. IEM works with a number of government agencies and private sector organizations around the world to improve protection and security for lives, infrastructure, and to really help states, regions, and communities recover more quickly from disasters. Like our other panelists, Lloyd's professional experiences are multi-sectoral. So Lloyd spent a number of years as a program associate director at the Office of Management and Budget, overseeing budgets for the Treasury Department, for FEMA, for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, Justice, and Commerce. Lloyd was instrumental in implementing President George W. Bush's presidential management agenda, and he oversaw the government's Homeland Security budget realignment in response to the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Prior to that, Lloyd served as the Chief Operating Officer of the Small Business Administration and the Deputy Chief Financial Officer at NASA. In all of these cases, Lloyd has had a role in leading the implementation of performance budgeting and financial management, but all of that work has often been in combination with engaging the private sector and the nonprofit sector as well. And in addition to his private and his public experience, Lloyd has had 2 jobs in the nonprofit sector, serving as the Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at Medgar Evers College of the City University of New York, and the Vice Provost for Fiscal Management at Louisiana State University. As an academic, Lloyd served here at the Maxwell School and also at the University of Washington's Evans School of Public Affairs. He's written extensively on issues of performance budgeting in government, discrimination in small business credit markets, and market-based reforms in government. He too has won a number of awards, not the least of which is the 50 Most Influential Minorities in Business. He's been a Kaufman Entrepreneurship Scholar at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a visiting scholar at the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And finally, I'd just like to say a special thanks to Bethany Wallawender and Kelly Coleman of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute. They've been super in helping to put this together. So I'm delighted to welcome Stan Soloway to join us today, and pleased to welcome Lloyd Blanchard back to the hallowed halls of Maxwell. Please join me in welcoming our panel speakers. So I'm going to be the timekeeper, and each of our panelists is going to have about 15 minutes to sort of offer some opening remarks about sort of the nature of the government-business relationship from their perspective and their experiences, and then we're going to open it up and have plenty of time for question and discussion. Anne?
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for hosting this event, and thanks so much for all your work in this area. And I've actually read your book on federal contracting. Yep, and he does amazing work.
Actually, Stan read part of it for having written the foreword.
I had to pretend I read it.
And it's also nice to be back at Syracuse. My cousin Barbara is here, who works at Syracuse University. My grandmother went to the School of Journalism here in Syracuse, and my grandparents grew up here, so it's just so nice to be back, so thank you. So sitting next to Stan, I'm having a flashback. Last time we were together was on a TV show called Government Contracting Weekly. Does anyone watch that show? No? It's a local cable show that runs in DC, and so Stan and I were on, and we have this little like rapport where we think we're really funny, and so we were going back and forth, and afterwards we were saying, we were funny, right? Like, they may spin off a show just for us. I think, like, seriously, I think we were good. And so I ran into a friend of mine a week later, and he said, you were on Government Contracting Weekly. And I said, yes, I was. And he said, you killed it. And I said, oh, thanks. I mean, I thought we were pretty funny. And he said, no, I mean, you literally killed it. It went off the air.
True story.
Yeah, it had like a 40-year run. Stan and I were on. Gone. So my apologies to the Maxwell School if something happens here today. But so this is a great subject to talk about, especially in the acquisition space. So the president was just down at South by Southwest, which is the big technology conference down in Austin, and he talked about ways to catalyze and convene the private sector to help us make government work better. And he was talking about it in the context of technology. And this is something that I think is particularly important in the acquisition space. The president talked about the creation of a team called the United States Digital Services, which is a team of technologists that we recruited from Yahoo and Google and Twitter to come into the government for short term and provide hands-on technology support for some of the IT projects in the federal space. And they came in the wake of healthcare.gov. And they've been helping to digitize some of our services. And so the president talked about how they took the application process for student loans and sped it up by 2/3 by digitizing that process. And so in the acquisition space, I think, when we want to think about making technology work better for government, fixing and improving IT acquisitions is a big part of that. And so I think before we talk about partnerships and how they work in the federal contracting space, it's important to understand the context in which we operate in the federal landscape. So the federal government spends $444 billion a year on goods and services through contracts. So there's no other company or government that is as large as the federal marketplace in terms of acquisitions. And we have 3,200 procurement units spread across the globe, and they all work independently with very little collaboration. And we have 37,000 contracting officers around the globe conducting those acquisitions. We have 2,000 pages of regulations that govern how we should do those acquisitions. We have socioeconomic goals, like we have to meet 23% small business goals as part of our acquisitions. And so it's just a very sort of complex space in which we operate. So partnerships become incredibly important for us. And when I think about the three greatest challenges for us in the federal marketplace, one is what I just mentioned, is the size and the scope and the organizational sort of structure of the federal marketplace, which is very siloed. The second challenge for us, I think one of the most pressing, is the rapid changes in technology and really changing how we do business. And how can the federal marketplace and the acquisition process keep pace with all those rapid changes? I mean, technology is changing how we do business dramatically. And so we tend to be a very slow process, right? And so how do we adapt and become fast enough and agile enough to take advantage of the technological changes? And then the third challenge for the federal marketplace is really around the workforce. And the Professional Services Council, which Stan used to lead, has done a lot of great work in this area, talking about the challenges of the federal acquisition workforce, who I think have very high technical skills, but they are trained to be generalists, and they don't have deep pockets of expertise in specific areas, especially around IT acquisitions. And I think also they're just generally very risk averse, and they're very focused on rules and processes, and it's sort of a check the box approach to acquisitions. And when you think about that in contrast to the technology world, it's in stark contrast. So how do you create an ecosystem that's much more agile, much more collaborative to kind of keep pace with the changes in technology? And when I think about partnerships in the federal marketplace, we're talking today about industry and government, but of course you could do a whole session just on government partnerships between bureaus, between agencies, even within an office, people aren't collaborating. But today we'll just focus on the government industry piece of it. And in the federal acquisition space, I think partnerships range from the most informal partnerships to very formal partnerships. And we're thinking about how do you create a greater amount of channels across that spectrum. So in the most informal, one of the first things I did when I was appointed administrator was sit down with Stan Soloway, who's like the godfather of federal acquisitions. And so you go and you pay homage to Stan Soloway in his corner office. But I went in all seriousness, and said, this is what I'm thinking. This is my plan for the next few years. And Stan said something like, you only got 2.5 years, kid. What do you think you're going to get done? But it's, that is a partnership in and of itself, right? It's albeit informal, but sitting down between industry leaders and government and talking about kind of the strategy moving forward. The most formal part of the relationship between industry and government is, of course, the contractual relationship. And even within a contractual relationship, you have levels of formality and informality. So you could have just regular meetings with your contractor. That's rather informal within the context of a contractual relationship. And it's amazing how often industry says to me that they don't have regular meetings with the agencies that have paid them good money to provide a good or service. And particularly when you think about complex IT systems, it's really important to have that constant communication. And where those relationships work well, you really have senior members of that company meeting with the senior leadership of an agency, certainly if it's a high-profile mission, critical acquisition, to talk about issues before they become problematic. And then within a contractual relationship, you also have very formal interactions like site inspections. So our office, which is responsible for driving regulations and policies and practices across the federal government consistently, we're thinking about how do we create greater amount of channels, both informally and formally. And we've launched a number of initiatives. One of them is called Acquisition 360, where for the first time we've gone out to industry and said, we want your input on specific IT acquisitions in the pre-award phase. So this is the first time we've done a transaction-based government-wide survey to industry. And so we directed all the agencies to issue the standard set of survey questions to industry after each IT acquisition award for a certain targeted amount, asking the standard set of questions. And of course, we're going to take that data and see where do we think we're doing well, where do we think we have issues. What makes it a 360 is we've asked the government program offices to provide feedback on that IT acquisition in terms of how the contracting office did, and vice versa. So it's a true 360 in terms of that specific IT acquisition. One of the things I've learned through the Paperwork Reduction Act, I don't know if you've studied that yet, is that you can't actually develop policy as a result of surveys. It's probably too long to explain, but in part because of the information we got through the surveys, as well as other research that we've done and other communications, we've discovered that one area where we need to do better is in the area of debriefings. We just don't do them well, and sometimes we don't do them at all. And I don't have any data yet to test whether or not that leads to a higher number of protests, but one would intuitively think it could. And it certainly doesn't help companies to become better federal partners and customers if you're not giving them feedback on how they performed. And this is one area where we're partnered with the Professional Services Council on how can we actually improve in the debriefing area, and what are the best practices in this space, and what are you hearing from industry about some of the best practices and some of the areas where we're not so great in debriefings. We've also launched a series of informal meetings with industry, we're calling Lift the Curtain, where we just talk about a range of issues covering the federal marketplace, like why companies make bid or no bid decisions, which is incredibly enlightening in just having those conversations, or market research versus market intelligence. I sat through several of those sessions, and in one of those sessions, industry said, a particular company said, you know, look, I went to an industry day that an agency did, which was a good thing, and they said, look, we're going to be launching a series of acquisitions over the next few years, want to get your input on how we should shape these, but the conversation ends today. and we're not going to talk to industry from this point forward, which is a little frustrating, right? Because the conversation needs to continue. So the series and the Acquisition 360 are just sort of two ways in which we're trying to kind of create a greater amount of interaction and partnerships with industry. We also think we need to create a much more robust supplier relationship management plan. This is what industry does quite well, where they think about their relationships with companies across the enterprise. And because we're so siloed, we really don't work with companies across the enterprise, the federal marketplace. And so one company may have 2,300 contracts with the federal government, which is actually true. One company has 2,300 contracts for very similar services. So you think about how expensive that is for them, how expensive it is for us, and they don't have anyone to work with across the enterprise to help sort of address the challenges or look at even opportunities of ways to work better together. And so a supplier relationship management program is really all about having a team just focus on tiering your companies, really tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Tier 1 could be a set of criteria you develop around how important is it to the mission of an agency, how many dollars do you spend. Whatever criteria you develop, you really develop a targeted set of strategies just for that tier across the enterprise. We don't do that well, and so that's just another area in a much more mature model. Are you giving me the peace sign, or are you saying 2 minutes?
Peace, baby. You
Okay,
got 2 minutes.
Thank you. Right, so I'll give back my 2 minutes and let these gentlemen use those
Really?
2 minutes to.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank
Ann.
you.
Stan?
Thanks. I'd like you to tell me when we're done what it is I say that other people think but would never dare say in public, because that could get me in a lot of trouble. We'll find out soon, I suspect. But it is really a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invitation, David, and agree about everything you said about Ann, who has been a great partner at OFPP across government and across the private sector in bringing people together. It's also a particular pleasure for me, having known Sean O'Keefe for a number of years, in many of his various positions and leadership, one of the iconic figures in government. And I don't know, Sean, we were on a commission together back about 12 or 14 years ago, and it was a little bit contentious. I thought I behaved relatively well, but you may disagree that I showed little filter. But Sean always has a great filter. And the last thing I'll say is prelude. I have to tell you that, I know there's nothing else going on campus this weekend other than the Bantle Symposium. But I want to know, and Sean, I don't know if you actually know this, it's a serious thing, that there is a connection between Syracuse basketball and national defense. There's a serious, a number of years ago, I was doing some advising over at the Missile Defense Agency. And I went over to have a meeting with the director. And his assistant met me at the door, and we were walking down the hallway. And we were chatting, and I'd met her before, and she said, yeah, don't let the meeting go too long because I want to catch a plane. I'm going home for the weekend. I said, oh, great, where are you going? She's up to Syracuse. I said, oh, yeah. She said, there's a big basketball game tonight I really want to go to. And I said, are you a big supporter? She said, oh, yeah. That was all she said. We walked into his office. I walked by her desk. Christine Beheim. So Jim Beheim's sister was the assistant to the director of missile defense. So that's where the Syracuse defense comes from. And God hope it shows up on Saturday night. Let me take this conversation a little bit different direction than Ann did, and I don't want to be overly negative, but I want to try to paint a picture for what I think we're dealing with. And I will tell you that a lot of these conversations, and Ann and I joke about this all the time, and it'll make perfect sense to Sean, are conversations we've been having for 25 years. Many of the same issues have been out there. We've been unable to get our arms around them, and it's very aggravating and frustrating, I think, to everybody on all sides of it. But let me just try to paint a little bit of a picture. So about 40, 42 years ago was the first time in American history that the private sector spent more money in research and development than the government. That was actually the first time. It was when the lines crossed. I believe it was 74 or 75. I forget what year it was. And since that time, the gap has grown, narrowed, and grown, but it's never come back to close to being even. And I think we're somewhere between $3.50 to $4 of every private dollar for every dollar of public R&D. That's a really interesting academic point. What does that mean? It means that the bulk of technology, the bulk of new development today, unlike any other time in our history, is coming from the private sector. And it's maybe related to, an offshoot from, or a grandchild of a government program. But the government is no longer the primary progenitor of technology and new solutions. That creates an entirely different world than the rules under which the government operates in acquisition and elsewhere were created. Because that was a world in which NASA, as Sean will tell you, was the leader. What NASA led to in terms of commercial offshoots was unbelievable. The bomb program, unbelievable. But those days are not over. The government's still a critically important R&D source. But by and large, research and development is in the province today of the private sector. And that's where the workforce also tends to gravitate. And so you no longer own the people or the technology. That, to me, suggests you have to have a very different thinking about how you engage with and talk to the marketplace in which you're trying to operate. So that's picture one. Picture two is, or second part of the picture is, we continue to have a substantial degree of schizophrenia in almost every administration, by the way. I'm not going to make any political comments on it and give one administration over another. But I'll use the last several years just as an example. But this is a bipartisan problem. And the schizophrenia is the party that's not in power tends to be pushing for all kinds of reforms they want to see happen, or the party that is in power is pushing for reforms, and the party in power makes those reforms a political issue. So let's go back to the Iraq War. There were 30-some-odd hearings on Capitol Hill around contracting in Iraq. And they identified some problems. And by the way, good luck doing it efficiently in a war zone. But what was really going on was the leader of the committee was using the business operations of government as part of the agenda to go after the Bush administration. It was very clear. It was a proxy for the anti-war statement. And you see the reverse today. You see the same thing happening with committees using a variety of issues as a cudgel to go after the Obama administration for reasons that have nothing to do really, ultimately, with the issues they're raising. So you have this sort of schizophrenia out there. So let's talk about engaging with the private sector. And I'm going to be a little bit provocative intentionally, but this is filtered, don't worry. When the president goes down to South by Southwest and says to the technology community, I need you to come help us, my response is, we're here. $445 billion worth of here. There are tens of thousands of really smart people who are here. There are others who are not that we need to get. I'm totally supportive of all this outreach to Silicon Valley, to Boston, to Austin, all these tech centers around the country. Fabulous ideas, important ideas. But there is an industry that has come into this space, and there's a reason why other industry has not. That question is the question that nobody seems to want to answer. We don't get into what are the barriers to entry for a small startup in Silicon Valley. What are the barriers to Google? Google actually gets a fair amount of government dollars today, but they don't do any direct contracting with the government because the rules are so arcane, they go through channel partners. Because you'd actually kind of like to have them in the room as part of that design team. They're selling through channel partners. So we have this schizophrenic system where we keep saying, bring me, bring me, bring me, but we don't want to fix the process behind it. The third part of the painting is the world that Anne leads is the contracting world. In the civilian agencies of government, that's basically who we're talking about when we talk about acquisition and procurement. On the defense and NASA side of government, that's about 10 to 15% of what we talk about when we talk about acquisition. The Defense Department has, give or take, 180,000 people in its acquisition workforce. Less than 20,000 of them are contracting officers. There are systems engineers, there are program managers, there are deputy program managers, there are logisticians. They're all part of this broader acquisition community that is essential to a program's success, if you really think of it from a systems engineering perspective. So when you're selling to the government, if you have a product or a service you want to sell, you actually have, we call it the three-legged stool. It's not like going to the procurement office at Syracuse, which I understand is unbelievably efficient. It's not like going to the procurement office and having the customer you deal with, they know what they want, and you do the deal. When you come into government, you've got an end user. So let's take an IT solution. It's the office that's looking to do something with its business systems or in cyber or analytics, but it's an IT solution. You've got the contracting office, which is often not only separate within the agency, but could be a completely separate agency where they have no actual relationship. And then you got the people who own the money. And you've got to tie those strings together. So we can have fabulous communications between a contracting office and an industry that actually means nothing if you don't actually have great communications also with the customer you're actually there to serve. Government is the only place in commerce where I believe, I don't know if there are lawyers in the room, I'm going to get my language wrong, but I believe the commercial world has a theory of implied authority, I think is the term, where the example you use is you're renovating your house and you sign the contract, but the contractor comes in and the husband or wife who didn't sign the contract is there and they say, yeah, I don't like that blue, get a different color blue. They go get a different color blue, it's all good because it's part of the same deal. In the government, the only person who can actually tell you to change the color blue is a contracting officer. The contracting officer may or may not have any connection other than signing that document to the customer. So it's a very different environment. So when we talk about engaging, and I mean, I don't want to get overly technical here, but when we talk about engaging, we've got to understand this is the environment in which we're thrust. So we take an acquisition workforce, ask them to go operate in an increasingly complex business world, which, by the way, not only is, it's not that technology, in quotes, is changing so fast. In fact, some people think Moore's law is no longer in effect. What's changing so fast is the changes to applications of technology. What's happening out in Silicon Valley, yes, there are great technology breakthroughs periodically, but the Valley is built around incredibly creative ideas of how to apply existing technology in new and different ways that no one had ever thought about. In some ways, that was the genius of Steve Jobs. He saw that. In a government system, trying to sit down with a technology workforce of 80,000 people that has a 10-to-1 ratio of people over 50 to those under 30, now think about, because I can say that because I'm well over 50, obviously. Imagine talking to people in my generation around some of this incredibly disruptive stuff that's taking place. We just don't get it. It's scary. It's not what we're used to. Now I have a business relationship with the contracting folks, 35 or 40% of less than 5 years of experience, and most of them have no business experience. They have no business training. They have to get all these certifications, and no place are they actually taught fundamental principles of business, risk identification, management, and so forth. That's the world in which we're talking about. So I don't think it's an issue, and I don't mean to question what Ann said, because we've actually been great partners. I think we have seen great examples of partnership. There was a place in Colorado called Rocky Flats. It was the site of many, many demonstrations years ago. It was a nuclear site. And the cleanup was just going, it was horrible. It was a disaster. They brought in a new company. They brought in a new program manager at the Department of Energy. And they beat the projections for getting it done by something like 6 years and $15 billion. And the program manager got an award. It's called the Service to America Medals. In fact, Sean, I don't know if you were at that dinner that night, but he got the Service to America Medal, which is the highest award, really, a civil servant can get. That's not and his comment was, that's what can happen when I bring the best of the private sector together with the best of the public sector. We got them together. That is not the norm because of a lot of the dynamics that I talked about a minute ago. But if you go back to my comment at the very beginning about where the world's going, where the technology is coming from, if we can't figure that problem out, the government is going to continue to lag further and further behind. And so when I kind of snarkily said, the president asked industry to come, and I said, we're here, there is a lot of innovation that has yet to be unlocked in companies that are doing business with the government. And I'll use one example. A lot of people like to use the term Lockheed Martin flittingly because they're the biggest player in the game, and they're seen as somewhat old school and not very innovative. Lockheed Martin is getting all kinds of kudos worldwide for their leading-edge research on climate. You don't hear about it. You don't hear about Boeing's work in force fields. The point is that it's the system that you operate in tends to drive and incentivize innovation and creativity. And there seems to be this dichotomy I'm talking about is we want the innovation and the creativity, but we're not creating the underlying opportunities to enable it. So that's where the partnership really has to come, as to how to create those opportunities.
Thanks so much, Dan. He had 2 minutes left anyway, Ann.
We've got 4 whole minutes, huh?
But now the former,
Well, he told us that he likes to talk way
the former professor now is gonna talk. Lloyd?
Well, thank you, David, and certainly thank you for inviting me back to my home. It's very nice to see a bunch of old friends here in the building and in the room. So it's definitely a pleasure. When I packed to come here, I purposefully left 2 holes in my wardrobe, one for the tie and one for the cufflinks. And I wanted to make sure I visited Manny's to fill those holes. So you see that I'm showing my colors and have been very excited about the success both the men and women have shown in basketball, my favorite sport. So it's very fun to be back on campus. You know, when David told me how we were going to approach these sessions, I asked the question that should we, reconcile public policy theory with practice? He goes, nah, don't do stuff like that. Nobody cares about that. Well, me being true to form, I'm not going to listen to what anybody tells me to do, so I'm going to do what I want to do. So I am going to try to reconcile a little theory and practice.
Is there an econometric model?
There is no econometric model, but I think there is some economics involved here. And Stan pointed to that, and I think it's very important, and that's incentives, and the incentives that drive organizations that might participate in the public-private partnerships. And I happen to believe that's one of the keys to properly aligning the organizations for effective service delivery. So just to give you a little bit of a story, to give you a sense of how I've come to where I am, not to repeat my bio, but when I was a graduate student here at Syracuse, one of the first papers I wrote and got published with my grad school mates, Chris Hennett and Wilson Wong, was a paper called Market-Based Reforms, toward a social subcontract, ? And this was a paper that questioned how citizens would, this was written in the late 80s, early 90s. It all jumbles together for me these days. But it was a paper written as idealistic graduate students, seeing a movement in the early 90s of increasing use of market-based reforms in government, increasing use of contracting government services to businesses to deliver services to citizens. And so the idea of a social subcontract comes from this idea of the social contract. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes have studied these issues. And the idea of the social contract is the idea that a sovereign people would give up some of their freedoms to a governmental authority and in return receive protection for rights, protections, security protections, as well as the kinds of government services that governments tend to provide. And so falling under where you sit depends upon where you stand on a particular policy issue depends upon where you sit. So at that point I sat as a lowly graduate student thinking I was going to change the world with this one little paper, right? And we were going to criticize market-based reforms. Well, over the years, I've sat in a number of different places, as David shared with you in the bio, but now I sit as a government contractor in a private firm with the incentives that drive that behavior. And so I'm thoroughly convinced that that little idealistic paper we wrote back as graduate students really was really the wrong critique. And I'm going to try to reconcile that critique with my current experience, thinking that social subcontracting is probably not a bad idea for various reasons that I think are related to incentives. When most people talk about market-based reforms in government, and I think that it's certainly related to the public-private partnership world, they tend to think that we're going to make government work like a business. And I've always been somewhat critical of that. But rather to think about government working like a business, in terms of wringing efficiencies out of government, a lot of through the initiatives you guys run, maybe we ought to think about letting business run the business of government, which is to say, in terms of public-private partnerships and the various organizations that would come to bear in delivering government services, let the businesses do what they do well, let the nonprofits do what they do well, and let governments do what they're supposed to do, which hopefully is tending to that social contract, but maybe using the notion of a social subcontract to bring in these partners to deliver whatever needs to be delivered. For businesses, things like administrative operations, financial management, accounting, auditing, these are standard activities that are done in any private sector setting that governments also have to do. We don't run procurements in the private sector the way government runs procurement, so it's a little different. But property management, these kinds of things. Governments have buildings they have to upkeep, they have to manage, et cetera. Private sector organizations know how to do those things very, very well. But there are things that, and we've learned this in my particular field of emergency management, where if you take a disaster that just wipes out a community, as we saw with Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, as we saw up and down the East Coast with Superstorm Sandy, as I've seen, and not seen firsthand, but certainly worked to rebuild a community of Moore, Oklahoma, which is a suburb of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and they were hit by the 2013 E5 tornado that just razed completely entire communities in that small local governmental town. And so in our world, it takes a lot of organizations to bring to bear to rebuild that community. And this is where you realize, or you try to figure out, who should be doing what, right? And so while a lot of these small communities like Moore regularly contract with firms like mine to help them rebuild, a lot of it has to do with the fact that they just don't have the capacity to manage the huge dollars that rain down upon them after a disaster. Usually these are FEMA dollars, right, to address the disaster in the near response and near term to rebuild roads and bridges and the like. But increasingly, it's HUD dollars, the Community Development Block Grant, which is one of the largest block grants in the federal government that pays for community development. The people that work in this space are usually people like Professor Yinger, who are concerned with fair access to housing and making sure that affordable housing is available to a broad range of citizens who may not have the resources that are equivalent to the norm. So we bring these kind of players to bear when we have to build communities like those and more, whether it's rebuilding, whether it's engaging and implementing a housing rehabilitation program, or whether it's implementing a down payment assistance program for affected households to get back into homes. And oftentimes, because these are dollars coming from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, whose mission is to sort of help the neediest of those of us in America to get into housing, they want to place priority over those particular citizens. And it's the government's job, meaning the city of Moore or the affected government, to develop the policies that would guide that. But oftentimes it's guys like us, private contractors, who help them put the infrastructure in place to do that. So as Director of Finance and Monitoring Services for an emergency management firm, for example, I try to make sure that the money is being spent correctly because, again, these small communities don't have capacity to do all of the things and meet all of the rules and regulations that the feds tend to impose. And as someone who's worked in the federal government and understands those rules, we try to help those local governments put the policies and procedures in place, build the internal controls and the monitoring procedures in place so that those monies are spent correctly, recovery does happen, things get done, things get built. So, as I sort of think about my experience in this space, this emergency management space, I think it's apropos to bring to this sort of conversation of public-private partnerships and figure out how to do this kind of thing and how to do it well. And certainly, I would suggest that a lot of what would drive the selection of who has what role in any given space, mine happens to be the emergency management space, is to determine what the incentives are, right? So government organizations have their own incentives that drive them. It may simply, in the federal government, just be responding to Congress or responding to their people, their constituents. For businesses, it's pretty clear. We're in it for the profits. For nonprofit organizations, their incentives are wholly different. Now, I've been critical in some areas to say that nonprofits aren't truly nonprofit. They just call it something differently. But certainly, we'd like to think that nonprofits still have a strong social mission to assure equal access of opportunities, to assure that those who don't have a voice, that their voice is being heard as government engages with private businesses and do the things that they believe they're called upon to do. Certainly, nonprofits have a strong role in advocacy. So when we implemented, for example, the down payment assistance program in the city of Moore to get people back into homes, obviously we have private contractors that we market to that build those homes. And hopefully they build them to the specs that are demanded by government policy that was made in order to create more access to low and moderate income households. We bring in a group that we brought in called the Neighborhood Housing Services of Oklahoma City to implement that down payment assistance program because they are already advocates in the community. They understand where the population, the target population are. And so they have people that have already advocated on the behalf of these communities. And so they can deliver these services in a way that isn't about putting profits in their pocket, but achieving their social mission of helping low to moderate income households get back into housing quickly after a devastating storm. And certainly for us private guys, we feel like we have a broad range of expertise that we can bring. And the incentives for us are simply to make our customers happy and get, the invoices that we expect to get the payments that we expect to get. And so it's the private sector that is quite responsive to doing things right, getting things done, that I think is going to be very important as we think about building greater effectiveness and efficiency in government service delivery. This is how I've come to the place where I am, where I started out working in the Bush administration, thinking about making governments more effective and efficient. Here at Maxwell School, thinking that it was the private sector that was in the way, but now, being a member of that lucrative private sector, we have some ways of helping government organizations, and I've sort of reconciled my own personal interests by telling myself that in chasing the dollar, I might actually be able to help people with real needs accomplish the goals that they seek from their government, and in doing so, meeting the demands of the social contract.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Great presentations from each of you. Zach is going to offer our first question. This is Zach Hoytink, and he's one of our fourth-year PhD students and writing his dissertation around issues of partnerships and the government-business relationship.
Well, thank you again to everyone for coming. Thank you, Stan. Thank you, Ann. Thank you, Lloyd. Thank you, David, for helping to put this together. Bethany, Kelly, and of course the Bantle family. Bob, thank you for your ongoing generosity and support of the university. Again, great presentations, and I think informative for everyone. Ann talking a little bit about why can't government run more like a business. Stan talking a little bit about how can we build partnerships with areas of business we don't work with. And Lloyd talking about how can government empower business to actually perform some governmental functions. And I think in each of those three areas, there's a problem with incentives. There's also a problem with culture. And one of your predecessors, Dan Gordon, who's a professor at George Washington University, during his tenure early in the Obama administration, launched something called a myth-busting campaign. And it had
We'll talk about that today.
and it had a little something to do with an issue that you raised. And just as an example, bid protests, a contract award has been made, a decision has been made, and someone who didn't win objects. And as a contracting officer, as I understand, that's something that you typically don't want to happen. One of the things that Dan tried to tell his contracting officers was the joint probability of having an award protested and the protest upheld was akin to being struck by lightning. He tried to communicate that, and then the response he basically got was, I made my contracting officers afraid of getting hit by lightning. Yeah. So where, in one way or another, where do each of you see overcoming those cultural impediments, overcoming the cultural impediment to acting more like a business, overcoming the cultural impediment to being a little more open-minded, to looking to other areas of business that are anxious to work with the government, and Lloyd, in your case, overcoming the cultural impediment to divest a little bit of what the government does and put it into the hands of non-governmental actors. So just anxious to hear a little bit of your thought, each of you, on that issue. Hopefully that will open up some additional questions to the rest of the audience. And again, thank you for coming.
Thanks.
Thanks, Zach.
Somebody just showed me the results of one of many surveys of the acquisition workforce, and it concluded, cultural barriers are the biggest hindrance to innovation or whatever. And it's so frustrating because I don't know what cultural means. Like, I get it sort of at a general way, but like, what am I supposed to do with that information? Because I don't know what culture means when someone says the culture is a problem. Because you ask 10 people that question, you'll get 10 different answers. Is it the rules? Is it your boss? Is it, is it the congressional hearings? Is it, so for me, look, I think it goes back to the workforce and the way they're trained. They are trained at these traditional institutes, which do generally a good job, but they are trained in the rules. And that's, Stan has talked about this, they start by learning the rules, and it becomes a very risk-averse process where you want to make sure that you've gone through the 85 steps and you're not going to get in trouble for missing one of those steps. The challenge is that at least in the technology world, the way we want to buy is much more agile and much more flexible. And we want to think about just the outcomes. What are the outcomes that you want? Not necessarily what are the 85 steps before the award, right? So a great example is an agency that issues a 100-page solicitation and they want brownies. And instead of just saying, I want some yummy, maybe somewhat healthy brownies, they say, I need the temperature of the water to be this, I need you to stir this many times, I need the size of the nut to be like this, and one size of the nut to be like that, and this is a true story. This is the way we go out to the market and say, this is what we want to buy. The result is that you spend your entire sort of contract management process, once you've awarded the contract, you're just focused on whether or not they actually met what we said they needed to do in order to deliver this, instead of just a very short, succinct statement of objectives of like, I want a yummy tasting brownie. And so what we've done is, it's such a massive space that we've tried to tackle this like a startup company, where you kind of think small, experiment, see if there's a new way to train the workforce, and then scale it up over time. So we started with a very small group of career contracting officers. We partnered with industry on what that training would look like, and we developed a new training outside of the traditional institutes. We put them through it for 6 months. It was a combination of classroom, virtual training, industry experience. Our first class is graduating the end of this month. We've got another class coming through. By the end of the administration, we'll have 60 trained core acquisition specialists in digital IT acquisitions that really focus on outcomes, writing short, succinct statement of objectives. They focus on breaking these large IT acquisitions into smaller pieces, running sprints, and really getting user input along the way. To Stan's point, they're thinking about the customer. What does the customer need? So for me, that is, I think, breaking through the cultural barrier. And we're starting small because we don't know if we nailed this training. So we're going to see if it really did get the desired results. We're going to tweak it, fine-tune it, scale it up. And if I can have a team of a couple hundred really well-trained digital IT acquisition specialists, at least in that space, digital IT acquisitions, I think I've broken through what they call the cultural barrier, because by its very nature, in sort of reflecting the commercial best practices, you are constantly engaging the customer, and there's lots of communication with industry, and it's less of a sort of rules-based process.
Zach, I think first of all, I think it's a mistake to talk about the acquisition community in a vacuum. I mean, this is fundamentally a classic change management problem. So if you don't have sustained leadership from the very top, forget about it. And so and again, I'm going to pick on this administration only because it's current, but this is no worse here than it's been elsewhere, for the most part. When the president and his top lieutenants in the first years of the administration are demanding that everything be fixed price and low price, because there's too many contractors making too much money, the workforce is going to do what they're being measured on. And if they're being told how many low-price contracts did you have, how many fixed price, they're going to do it, even if they're incredibly stupid for the solution they're trying to get, right? So it starts up here. And I will say, one of the things I thought in the Clinton administration, I think to a certain extent in the Bush administration, you did have senior leadership that was pretty consistent about willing to challenge some orthodoxy. And so people were willing to break some China. We've kind of gotten away from that, and I think you just look at the broader political environment and think about how hard it is inside the system to challenge orthodoxy. I think, also, when you talk about what's going on, for instance, in digital services, this also becomes a leadership issue. And I don't want to be too high level on this or too esoteric, but fixing websites, making them really good, giving people access, like the Citizenship and Immigration website, which is one of the things that Digital Services Corps is working on, is great. That's not innovation. That's not fundamentally changing how we do work. That's not changing the underlying system. But it gets touted as that, and not only by Ann, but by the administration, because everybody sees this much bigger barrier to how do I actually change the dynamic. And frankly, outside of Ann, and OMB in this administration has had some of the best leaders they've had in years. But that was not matched in other agencies. which leaves them outside a little bit in the field alone. So I think this is, number one, it is a willingness of an administration to do things that are unorthodox, and it's very hard in the current environment. I don't know how you solve that, but it is the world in which we throw the contracting officers. They're just a microcosm of this. I mean, this is true across government. So we see pockets of innovation. We're seeing more and more experimentation, but relatively narrow because the risks are so high. But I do want to come full circle back to what Lloyd was talking about and your comment about. So we look at like the social contract. Government is not, cannot be, and never will be a business, nor can it operate like one. What government has to do is let businesses operate like businesses. So where I'm going to use business for whatever it might be, I got to let them operate like they do. And we actually don't do a very good job of that. So even to the social contract, I've argued for years, and this commission Sean and I were on, got to the heart of this question about what's appropriate and not appropriate for the private sector and so forth. I've argued for years, I'm totally open to the idea that there are many things that the private sector shouldn't do. But where we think a contract can work, a contract well done is probably your best guarantor of an outcome, because I now have control in ways I don't through grants, and certainly through a traditional civil service system. I lose control. So what are they doing? Look at the UK today. They're doing more and more what they call pay for performance. They have just taken their entire welfare to work program, the entire thing, thousands of employees, and contracted it to a company that happens to have a fair amount of expertise in social services. And they're only getting paid not by the number of people they process, but how many people get a job, how many of them still have a job after 6 months, which becomes a very key, statistically, a telling point of were you successful or not? I can get anybody a job, but if they're fired 3 weeks later, what good have I done anybody? So they're using a contract vehicle with incentives tied to the social contract they're trying to achieve. And the company's not getting paid if they don't achieve that. So you can use social contracts, business contracts, to fulfill social contracts. We just don't think that way in government. We think about the process. Are you compliant with the various accounting rules? You know, if I said to you, I'll give you $100 to come wash my car. You wash my car and it's beautiful, you detail it, and you say, I'd like my $100. I say, well, how long did it take you? What does it matter? I washed your car. You said, no, yeah, but I'm only going to pay $15 for an hour's work. That's crazy. And how much water did you use? And how much soap did you? That's a sort of classic process focus rather than outcome focus. So, I mean, we're doing a great job of identifying problems here, not identifying a lot of solutions. But until we can get over that hump, and I think the technology piece is where it's going to have to happen. Mm-hmm. So when we used to argue vociferously, should I have a contractor do this? Should I have a government employee do this? That's not going to be the issue going forward. The issue is going to be going forward, should I have a government employee do this, or should I have technology do this? Because the technology shift, if you really think about what the cloud generates and where it takes you, it changes the nature, scope, size, and character of the workforce like nothing we've seen in 50 years. That's where the debate, I think, is actually going to finally have to turn, or the government will literally be generations behind it, and I think public demand will drive it differently. There's a reason that the state of Alaska, I forget how many years ago, was the first state to go to online driver's license renewal. Because the consumers in Alaska said, we're tired of driving to the 4 cities in the state, which could be 20 hours away, because that's the only place you have processing centers.
Which is a website, which you just dismissed.
No, I think websites are great. No, you missed my point. I think websites are great, but they tend to make us think too narrowly. I think you need to be thinking much more broadly about how we're doing the work. That's my point. I'm not.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's innovation in R&D, right, which is important. But then there's also all the customer-facing tools that government provides, like websites, which is what the average person uses. And when you look at the government's websites, they're atrocious, right? And we're just asking them to do basic services. So I'm just thinking about the common person.
Yeah, no, I'm not. I didn't mean to put down the websites. I'm saying it tends to narrow our aperture and think we've done this. So let me just use one example. Lloyd, you talked about facilities. The government manages tons of facilities. I don't know how many people GSA has. You were there, Public Building Services, thousands of employees.
Thousands, yeah.
DOD, I don't know, Sean, if you remember from your dollar days, but how many people we had doing facilities management? Tens of thousands, billions and billions of dollars. There's a company in Chicago, this is what I'm talking about, turning the egg. There's a company in Chicago that manages 50,000 facilities around the world. 50,000. Office parks, Lowe's, Home Depots. They have 300 employees. Everything is managed through apps. And if you think about, and I'm overly simplifying, it is Angie's List and Uber married and on steroids. And so in this area, I might have 6 HVAC contractors, 6 electrical contractors, 10 pavement guys, whatever it goes into managing a building, all the different pieces. The call comes, no call, I don't get on the phone. I go on my app, HVAC problem at Maxwell. It goes through a system that is constantly being updated with data, customer ratings, just like Uber, who's available, who's closest with the highest number of stars, blah, blah. That person gets the order, they come in, you rate it right away. It's this constant cycle. They're saving 35, 45% because these organizations no longer have to have infrastructure support like they used to. And 70% of the dollars are going to local small businesses. We talk about a social contract. It's all cloud-enabled, web apps. That's my point about how we're changing business. So I'm not knocking website. I'm saying there's ways in which we could fundamentally, you want to get at the federal budget, these are the tools that are going to get us there. We're not going to get there by slicing this by 5% or that by 4%. That's right. That's where I think the incentives ultimately going to have to come from.
IT acquisitions is $50 billion out of the $440 billion that we spend. So we're starting in that space across a wide spectrum. We think of IT commodities with one set of strategies tailored to those, and IT systems with a different set of strategies. And we've got about 25 underway. We just don't have time to talk about them all. But my point is that when we try things for the first time, talk about change management, if I launch it across 440 billion, 3,200 procurement units, I'm going to fail. So I am intentionally actually starting very narrowly because there are lessons learned here. And this idea of creating more specialized acquisition teams, if this one works, why not apply it to facilities, to real estate, these are all acquisitions, construction, that are completely different, that have their own set of skill sets, and people don't know what the practices are in the private sector. So.
Yeah, again, I didn't mean to criticize them, but just remember, we're not buying...
This is why we were so good on TV.
We're not buying facilities management. We're not buying logistics. We're buying technology. It's the technology that's managing it. See, so you got to be careful sort of how you parse it. Sorry, Lloyd, go ahead.
But in construction, I'm not buying technology, but okay.
So Zach, I guess, no, this was wonderful. I'm going to tune in next time you guys are on TV.
No, let's let you talk.
No, it's okay. I don't need to talk. But I do think some of these challenges are real and worth talking through and having vigorous debate. Certainly, how do you change cultural barriers is something, I thought long and hard about with regard to race relations in America. And I do believe that it falls back to what I said earlier about where you stand on a particular issue depends upon where you sit in some sectoral or organizational setting. In terms of race relations, you want one group to understand the other group, you got to put that group in that other group's shoes. That's hard to do historically. In some cases, we might have been able to accomplish that. In others, we, are a long way away. Certainly, with regard to African Americans in this country, but organizationally and in big places like the federal government, you've got people with a lot of different functions that you can, sort of move the deck chairs, right, and put people in uncomfortable places often, but to get them to understand the other person's perspective. This is one of the things Mr. O'Keefe was very good at when he took over organizations in the federal government, was to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic. It created a lot of problems. It created a lot of hand-wringing and angst. Sean, you were great at that. You know it. But what it did was open people's eyes about different perspectives in the process. And maybe, just maybe, we could move that ball forward to organize ourselves in a little more of effective and efficient way. We were talking about this earlier, and this goes to your question, Zach, wherever you are. There you are. About how do we sort of move more effectively to divest, if I heard you correctly, governmental functions to private sector functions, if you will. Every administration since the Clinton administration has tried to do this. I know that, I heard, I guess, through the NPR, they tried to do it through their sourcing initiatives. In the Bush administration, we tried to do it through what we call competitive sourcing and the presidential management agenda. I don't know what you call it with the Obama administration, but I'm
Doesn't
sure
exist anymore.
you're deep in it. But the idea of what is an inherently governmental function and what isn't inherently governmental. You wouldn't believe how difficult that question is to answer, especially in a big place like the federal government, where there are thousands of functions that span across this huge spectrum. Where do you draw that line, right? What's inherently governmental and what's not? And as Ann suggested earlier, and we shared the same experience, when you start that initiative, you send out the survey, here are all the functions we see that exist in your agency, here are the number of positions we see attached to these functions. Please tell us which of these are inherently governmental and which are not. And they would all come back pretty much like we sent them out, right? And so there would be this sort of very little change in moving what we thought was inherently governmental to the non-inherently governmental space, which is what is necessary in order to sort of, let's free up this space so private sector can do it or nonprofit can do it. We're not forcing civil servants to do this kind of work, the kind of work that would easily be done in other sectors. And I think this falls under the idea that incentives drive a lot of this train, right? Think about the incentives that the civil servants who would answer these questions, think about their incentives, right? You're asking a civil servant, tell us which of these positions are going to allow you to keep your job and which of these positions we can give to the private sector, right? Well, of course, they're going to say, well, these are all inherently governmental positions. And it goes back, and we make no change from 3 administrations in sequence that face the same problem, regardless of party. So it's a behavioral thing that we have to solve. And I think as we understand how to properly use public-private partnerships to accomplish the role of government and the wishes of a society, we have to think about the incentives that drive those various organizations and how they're properly placed in that partnership so that they're driving what they would do as well as can be done, and the government still has its role and function of managing what we deliver to citizens.
Can I just add one thing? Because I want to give an example of where we actually have done what you talked about. And I think it's been pretty successful, but it took years to get there. And that's military housing. Back in the early 90s, I guess, when we realized that some significant percentage, and Sean Manfred, there was 60%, some high number percentage of military housing was substandard. It was, didn't meet code. At the same time, we were starting to see all kinds of retention issues in the military. There was one point later in the 90s, I remember the commander of the Pacific Command saying to me that, we're not getting, sailors aren't coming in for 5, if it's in for 5, stay for 20, so that's gone. They come back from sea duty, they're headhunters waiting for the enlisted guys on the docks. And they say, how's your life? You like being at sea 10 months a year, making $20,000 and living in poverty-level housing? What if I paid you $50,000, sent you to graduate school? There was this issue. The incentive became to the military, ultimately, a retention and troop support issue. So we started down this path, and I forget what year. Sean knows much more detail how this all kicked off. But there was huge resistance, particularly amongst the senior military. Huge resistance. So think of the senior military as sort of the government employee looking at an inherently governmental debate. Because it was all about my base, my men. In those days, there were obviously very few women. My men, right? It was that mentality. So we also tried to do a lot and failed early on. I mean, there was some real struggles. We discovered, as I say we, I wasn't actually in charge of any of this at the time, but we discovered we didn't know a lot about real estate law. We also didn't know a lot about real estate development and incentives. Think about incentives. So the fact that I could not turn a private military facility over to a developer, they're not going to do the deal because they can't own the underlying property. That's the long-term, right? So there's all these things we had to learn. Fits and starts, fits and starts. And I remember specifically in 1999 being at a small session we had with the Brits because they were sort of facing many of the same issues, not just on housing, but a bunch of stuff. And there was a general who was the commander of a major army command with us. And he was giving a talk at the table. There was a group of us at a table. And he said, look, he said, I'm all in favor of doing this as much as we can with the private sector. But at the end of the day, it's about esprit de corps. I need my soldiers on base. They want to be on base because we are, the brotherhood, the families are connected. We've created a community. And he was very impassioned. He was absolutely opposed to this. That night, his aide stuck his head in the, I was sitting in an anteroom talking to some people, his aide stuck his head in the door, asked if he could talk to me privately. So I went out with him, I said, what's up? He said, I just got to tell you, because I love the general. He said, this is not about him. He said, but when he says, my #1 concern is esprit de corps and taking care of the troops, none of the troops believe him. Because otherwise we wouldn't be living in rat holes. And oh, by the way, our wives don't want to live on base anymore. They want to be part of a community so that when we deploy, there's not a ghetto of just families with no spouses and so forth. So the culture of the service and the folks coming up really, I think, and Sean, you can disagree with me, I think that became really the force. There was a legislative press and there was a financial press and all this, but it was really that enabled a big cultural change. And I don't know what the percentage is, but the vast majority of troop housing now is privatized. Some of it's on post, some of it's off post. You go to San Diego, there's beautiful Navy facilities off the base, bachelor officer quarters and so forth. Really, because of this cultural change that was taking place, it was consumer driven. Is that, and we saw a huge change. Sean, I don't want to put you on the spot, but would you agree with that?
It's an interesting example, but every administration has had a different viewpoint about insourcing versus outsourcing. And to Lloyd's point, it has never changed. Like, the percentages that is contracted out has never changed. And it's a whole range of factors. But I think it was under the Bush administration that they had the public-private competition that was supposed to occur. And 95% of the time, government won, whatever that competition was. And I think there's a whole range of issues around, you know, it's incredibly difficult for a supervisor to make a decision about whether they're going to contract out, you know, and potentially lay off employees. You've got unions, you've got difficulty in making that apple-to-apple comparison of cost, private sector versus government. It's incredibly challenging.
Why don't we take some questions, other questions from our audience? You've been sitting there so patiently. Yeah.
I'm not familiar with the subject, but what would you? Oh, I'm not, any knowledgeable in the subject, but what would you think about the Affordable Care Act and improvements possible? And what's your opinion about a single payer system?
We'll start with the Obama administration.
Yeah, let the administration talk to that.
That is outside my purview. Sorry. We'll talk about the acquisition.
Well, I'll start. I really don't know, man. I think we all observed the challenges in implementing the Affordable Care Act. I think those challenges were born of a very large initiative that can't get done without the proper coordination across a lot of different organizations with a lot of different incentives. And I keep hammering on incentives, but people are funny. They bring their agendas to the table, both individually and organizationally, if we're to sort of raise it to a theoretical level. But it's real on the ground. And how we coordinate all of that activity so that everybody's rowing in the same direction has never been easy. It's not easy at the local level of government. It certainly is not at the federal level. I'm not going to comment on what I think about single-payer system. I do think theoretically it might be more efficient, but in practice, Lord knows, right? Because you've got to make a shift from one regime to another regime, which is a pretty big shift. And so, practically speaking, it would be hell. Theoretically, ideally, there are arguments to be made. And I think many of those who feel the burn in the room, I'm not representing that, Sean, please. I'll never get another phone call back from him again if I did.
Other countries have worked it out.
Pardon? Well, I don't want to argue about that. The point is, it does take many different players to make such a large change successful. And I think it's apropos to this conversation about how do we organize those various different players in various different sectors to do it effectively.
So I just make one comment, nothing about the Affordable Care. I'm not an insurance expert, but we had this conversation earlier today, and I think it is apropos of this conversation about partnership, social contracts, and so forth. One of the questions that people are starting to talk about, but haven't really had to talk about, but I think of it here at Syracuse with the big investment in veterans' health, is does the Affordable Care Act suggest that down the road we should be taking a different approach to veterans' health? i.e. the specialty care that veterans need coming back from a war clearly is a veteran's health need, but the day-to-day care, the sort of routine care, may not be. So are we thinking about how we give access to veterans to health care in the right way, given the changed circumstances? I'm not saying we are or we aren't, but it's a conversation that we're not really having. But it's again, the world's changing. We don't do a very good job at the government level of turning the ship.
Mm-hmm.
Johnny, did you have a question?
So you've been talking about the role of business in helping to deliver public services more efficiently. There's another really big issue that you haven't touched, which is that when the private sector gets involved in the delivery of services, it has an opportunity to change the agenda, to change the policies, to change what the objectives are. And a couple examples. One of them is and I know the state and local sector much more than the federal sector, but in the state and local sector, there's been enormous private involvement in prisons. And there's a lot of evidence that the policies that states selected for prisons changed, like 3 strikes and you're outlaws were partly a result of heavy lobbying by businesses who would benefit from having more people in prison. Another example that's playing out all over the country is that when you start having charter schools, you give businesses a role because they provide the facilities and they provide the supplies and they may provide the curricula. And so they lobby for more charter schools, and that's not coming out of the standard mechanisms for making public decisions. And I wonder if we could get your perspective on how you change the political landscape when you bring, particularly in complicated settings. I'll be very interested to watch the experiment in Great Britain that you talked about, because I think it's not just a matter of changing the incentives and getting better delivery. A lot of other things are going to happen when you move to that system. Anyway, I just appreciate your perspective on that issue.
I think you raise a really important point, but I think we need to kind of parse it into multiple pieces. So the prison one is very, very interesting. I wrote a piece for a book at Harvard Law School on sort of contracting and the role with government, and there was a group of law professors. Their chapter was all about prison privatization and the concerns they had. And the concern was really driven by the fact that when you're talking about prison, you're talking about the fundamental intersection of the state and the individual and the sensitivity of that kind of activity. And I totally, by the way, I'm completely sympathetic. But leaving that aside for a second, try to take that off the table to have it just from an objective perspective, I do think the lobbying piece is an ethics issue. That's a different issue from the vehicle itself, the business relationship you can manage and drive if you have the right people in the right place doing the right thing. That doesn't mean it's done right all the time. In fact, it's done horribly sometimes. And we've seen it in some prisons. Heck, there have been cases of judges who've had investments, right? We've seen all of this play out. But let me flip that around. Several years ago, there were about 8 states that were really struggling with their public assistance programs, the costs and so forth, the expansion. And it was a group of technology companies, independently and together, that actually were marketing, in quotes, to the states, a way to take all of their public assistance program application processes and consolidate them. So you don't have to do a separate application for WIC and TANF and unemployment. It's all a college common app idea. And it was both a cost saver, also better for the consumer, because these people don't have to go stand in different lines every other week to unemployment office and what have you. And a number of states, red and blue, I mean, it was not a political issue, said this is a great idea. We can really affect change with this. The next thing we know, there's an amendment on the floor of the Senate saying that any state that allows a non-government employee to see or touch any personal data of any citizen will lose their administrative grant for their public assistance programs, which of course kills the whole thing. Obviously that was coming from the unions. My point is, there are both sides on all these lobbying all the time. That's a constant tension in government, but it's not a reason not to look at how and where you might be able to drive better outcomes while addressing this. So yes, there are risks. There are risks to the privatized housing for the troops. For the most part, it's worked well because the agreements were constructed in a way that incentivized the behaviors that society or the military wanted to see. It's not just about dollars and cents when I say incentives either.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a, you raise an important but very broad issue about money in politics, right? And the power of lobbying. And there's way too much money in politics and way too many decisions being made by very powerful, well-moneyed groups. In my world, in the federal contracting space, thankfully, we are a merit-based system where contract awards are made by law on performance, right? Nothing, you don't consider other factors, whether you don't lobby contracting officers. The statute that created my office says I can't even give the appearance of influencing a contract award in an agency. I'm purely policy. I don't get lobbied by these groups. I have discussions with industry about purely policy issues. So I'm a little bit buffered from that world, but you raise a much broader issue about public policy making in general and how these groups are influencing Congress and others.
Well, but I think, again, coming back to the practice, leaving the sort of social contract examples, let me give another example where I think we go overboard with this. So in the technology, I represent several technology companies, both Silicon Valley and existing contractors. In the technology world, if you're a company, you select a company to help you with your technology that when you do your due diligence, this is the company I want to work with. And they come in and they help you examine all of your existing systems and help you figure out what you need to do to make them better, right? I mean, it's sort of, think of it from a design build, if you will. In government, that's considered a conflict of interest. So I can't help an agency think through what their technology problems are and recommend solutions and then implement, because that's a conflict. That's illogical. But we've gone so far overboard to sort of draw walls that it prevents you from, so there are a lot of companies who won't get involved in the upfront part. There's no incentive to do a study.
And that's law.
So Johnny, I think you raise very good points. And I don't have the answer, certainly, to the money, influence, and politics stuff, which I think is part of your question. I think there can be some organizational responses that can tamper some of that behavior. And that behavior, I would argue, does cut against the merit basis of procurement, of the procurement environment. As a person who engages in business development regularly, you know, the largest predictor of whether I win a particular contract or not has little to do with merit, or has some bit to do with merit, but has mostly to do with my relationship. Well, it has mostly to do with my relationship.
State and local?
I think that's at any level. If they know who I am, if they like me, if I then bring the resources that they believe I can bring to help them accomplish their goals, then I'm able to win a contract.
But there is a process by which they review your performance, they review your background,
Absolutely.
they
Absolutely.
define what it is they need, they look at your financial record. So it's not like they like you and you've got a contract.
Well, no, I'm just saying, let's not close our eyes to what also happens.
Well,
you know.
you certainly have to interact. Look, you're talking about building relationships with agencies, putting a face to a company. Like that's real, but that's to me different than lobbying.
Well, I think what we can get at, let me finish that point. I do believe that fairness in procurement is similar, the issues of fairness in procurement are similar to the issues of fairness in individual rights. And that is to say, you know, think about, you know, in the research we've done together, we've looked at what drives the outcome for jobs for individuals, right? What is the one thing that you need to do to get a job after you graduate from this fine place? It's the network, right? It's not necessarily what you know, but who you know. We've all heard this, and we've seen research, no less, to support that fact that it's, you know, the job market is not completely merit-based. And I don't want to really focus on that. I do want to get at Johnny's issue about why, you know, if we're arguing for the support of businesses to help government deliver its services, and things can go awry when businesses and their interests get involved that cut against the government's interest, part of what we've been able to do in response to that, and I don't know if it was in response to these particular examples in charter schools and in incarceration, but in the emergency management space, one of the things that I think we found in the past that has led to the way we do things now is, you know, when you contract with a business to rebuild homes, that business has certain interest and incentives to rebuild homes in a certain way. They may cut against the interest of HUD that may be paying for that rebuilding of homes. So what does HUD require? HUD requires that in all of these contracts, there's some encouragement to bring in advocate groups, right? That's where the nonprofit sector comes in, to bring in advocate groups that ride shotgun, if you will, with the businesses in these contracts to do what the government wants, to rebuild those homes to specifications that create access to low to moderate income households. And the advocates are the ones that enforce that, right? They're at the table, both at the policy setting stage, if you will, the writing up the RFP stage, if you will, but also in the delivery stage. And so the example I gave earlier about, we wrote the policy for the down payment assistance program, basically took the general parameters of our client, the city government. We wrote the policies based on those parameters, wrote the procedures based on those parameters, but gave it to the advocate organization to deliver the service. And the advocate had the beneficiary at heart. Their mission was to help the types of beneficiaries that the city was trying to get to. If we had delivered those services, I'd have gone to a contractor who has his own, a building contractor, for example, who has his own incentives that may have built that project in a different way than, say, a housing advocate group. So in response to incarceration, for example, to what extent do those private firms that are contracting with the Bureau of Prisons, for example, to what extent do they incorporate advocacy groups that have the prisoners in mind more than efficiency and effectiveness in service delivery? In terms of charter schools, to what extent do the other groups that have interest in the education of the children in those charter schools, to what extent are they at the table in the delivery of the charter school model itself? And so I think this is where making sure you bring these different roles to bear in public-private partnerships in such a way that they get at the various pieces which are consistent with their own values and incentives, I think you can get that part right. You might actually deliver services in an effective way that meets some of the equity and the multiple goals that we try to achieve often.
Sean, did you have a quick comment?
Yes, just real quick, just to follow up. I think Ann's exactly right on this one. You really have to separate the issue of conflict of interest, influence peddling, lobbying, all that, which is a serious set of problems, from the issue of exactly how do you frame the nature of what the public requires as articulated by the government. That's what we're talking about here. So the combination of those two is what frequently starts crossing over lines, and folks get very confused by it. And as a consequence, part of what Stan was lamenting here of this volume of requirements you have to follow through with is born of each and every one of those, Shaggy Dog story, disasters that occurred because someone broke the rules and an enactment of another set of requirements that make it prohibitive that you use your best judgment on things and instead be a rule-based, compliance-focused organization. Hence, the reason why you've got folks going through these training programs that Stan's referring to, where your first job is to learn the rules. Rote memorization is valued in order to make sure you don't get fried. And that's the mindset that kind of gets started with this whole approach. Instead, though, I think if you separate that and set it aside, if we could figure out a way to, from a public policy standpoint, to certainly penalize folks who transgress on these things within an inch of their life, as an example to everybody else, whatever you want to do. And then also differentiate, though, to say, to the issue that Johnny's talking about, how much input do you want? Not influence, input do you want from folks? Because then this gets to the question Ann raised, and the ideal circumstance of saying, why are you going to prescribe the exacting requirements for a stinking brownie when all you're going to say is, I really want something that tastes good, it looks like a brownie, okay? use your imagination, tell me how it's going to work, or it satisfies some larger objective, something that isn't even prescribed as a brownie. It could be just, I want some conclusionary confection that you want to add to this. Use your imagination, be creative, give me the best solution you think you can find and the least cost, or whatever your prescriptive criteria is. When you do that, you get what Johnny's referring to.
Yep.
Folks then come back with ideas that say, well, look, if you do the following things, this will really meet your objectives. And if you leave the process that wide open, it lends itself to that creative interpretation that I believe is absolutely invaluable. It is, but on 1% or 2% or whatever it's going to be, you're going to get the kind of interpretations he rendered, would say you're looking at some counterproductive impact, consequence that occurs as a result of the approach that you advocate. And that could be a consequence, and it could be an interpretation. It could be a misunderstanding. It could be any number of things. But it lends itself to all those factors, which is never the intent of trying to find a more imaginative solution to stating what it is you think you need and letting the industry, as Stan described, which is the paragon of what's left of innovation and technology development, because the government sure isn't doing anywhere near as much as it used to. And that's where that ought to originate, and that's where you want to find those creative solutions, but not at the expense of the underlying public policy objective.
I think that's, Sean, I think that's, as usual, really well put, and I would just add to that, that goes back to the point I made earlier. And so we talked here about social issues such as incarceration, education. That's one piece of the pie, but the biggest piece of contracting and procurement dollars go out towards technology, operations, maintenance, those kinds of things. And so I don't want to get the two mixed, because I think you do get into different kinds of discussions in different areas. Just to reiterate something Sean said, we talked about the rules. I've made this comment before. Just so you know, what we're talking about is new contracting people in government who have come in today are told that by the leadership, we want you to be critical thinkers. And the first thing we're going to do is we're sending you to FAR boot camp. FAR is the Federal Acquisition Regulation. So they go to boot camp, and on day one, I'll guarantee you they're not critically thinking on day two. And just to foot stomp on this insane system we've created over many, many decades, the other day it was announced that the Air Force has a new contract with IBM's Watson. You all familiar with Watson, the cog computing? My first reaction was, this is fabulous, because you could really use cognitive computing in really complex acquisitions in really creative ways. I mean, it could really drive some. You know what their example of how they're going to use it is? To help them decipher the rules. I guess maybe it's just being crotchety, but if our rules are so complicated we need cognitive computing to figure them out, then we ought to throw the damn rules away.
So we've got about 15 minutes left. I got Charlene with the question and Alvaro with the question.
Hi, my name is Charlene. I'm a MPA MAR student here at Maxwell. So Stan touched upon consumers driving innovation forward in both the example of Alaska and the military housing. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on consumers, which are ultimately the ultimate beneficiaries of all these programs that you're trying to fix through these partnerships, in how do they or how could they help move these partnerships and these innovations forward when it seems that these decisions are being made at a much higher level?
Great question.
Yeah, so we're not that great at getting end user input in the things that we design, right? And if we had, we'd be much better at it. And so part of the way we're getting at it is through the training that I talked about, which is very much focused on how you bring in end users along the way to get their feedback as you're designing a system. Another way we do this is, and I think this is a fairly recent development, at least in my office, we post our draft policies for public comment. And it adds to the process, it adds to the timing, but we think it's worth it, right? And so we posted, for example, a draft policy on better managing how we buy our software. And we got back a lot of great industry input, primarily industries and contracting groups like Stan's former group, respond to these. We get great feedback. We get told, hey, you may not be aware, but the way you talked about that particular technology is really narrowing yourself, and it's almost vendor specific. We didn't realize that. Or you should be thinking about cyber in the context of software and how you buy it and manage it. And so that kind of feedback is one way we get sort of end user input, at least from the contracting community and also through our training. But
I think there's another question, though, that you're raising. I mean, I agree with Ann, but I think you're raising another question. So the way I think about it is the government, by and large, is not going to be on the front line. I mean, they're not going to be the first. In some areas in national security they are, but I'm talking about in sort of day-to-day operations. I'm not sure I want the government taking a Silicon Valley attitude towards the world. I mean, there's an 85% failure rate in Silicon Valley. It won't be very long for the taxpayer to say, hey, enough's enough, right? We're not. So I think that the way that consumer input begins to drive some of this, and one of the things that gets back to the point Sean was just talking about when you think about your engagement and communication cycles and sources, is looking at what's going on in the real world that consumers are driving and having the vision to see how could that change what I'm doing, because it's already been determined over here. This is a bad analogy, but back in the day when we were doing acquisition reform, we got really tired. The Brownie example, back when he was running for vice president, I guess it was during the Clinton election, Al Gore went on David Letterman, and he brought an ashtray. And he was talking about the National Performance Review, which was the big reinventing government. He talked about the specs that went into making this ashtray, the pages and pages. It's an ashtray, right? So it's the same thing as the Brownie example, okay? So they just went out and said, we just need an ashtray. But when they started thinking about changes, it was really visualizing how what's going on out here can change the way I'm doing it back here, because I'm not going to I don't need to reinvent the wheel. So take an ashtray, or take the military, where they were all of a sudden the Marines, I forget who the commandant was in Korea, and he looked down and he said, I was wearing boots, or the same boots that my father wore. Something's wrong. These are old, they weren't. So they struck a deal with Gore-Tex, I think it was, or somebody, and the next thing you know, pretty quickly they had new, very contemporary boots. They didn't invent it, but I guarantee you they tested the hell out of it. And that became sort of a joke, because the consumer had already decided Gore-Tex was the fabric that worked, right? The sleeping bags were warm enough, the jackets were warm. So my point of all this is it's the ability and the vision to see what's going on with an Uber, or what's going on with not that you've married, or what's going on in facilities, and figuring out how I can apply that internally. I'm not creating something out of whole cloth. I already know consumers are driving me in that direction. What's out there that I can now adapt? That's where you get the consumer driver. Because as Ann said, most people, frankly, outside of government contractors, politicians, and federal employees, most people could care less who's actually delivering the service. What they care about is, are they getting the service? And are they getting the right service? So the point about prisons, it's less about it's privatized. It's more about there's violations of the social contract taking place that offends people. Do you follow me? That's where I think it's going to come from. Lloyd?
So I think what makes government and a democracy hard is citizen participation. And in general, we have to find ways, using technology or other means, to figure out how to use citizens' input and use it effectively. Because, this age of internet, we all read our favorite blogs and newspapers, and then you get to the comment section and, you stop, And I imagine some of us who have worked in government have read similar comments, right? That just says, you guys just ought to go home. That's how you do it more effectively. But the point here is, I think you raise a valid question, but it's hard to do because citizens don't come trained like Maxwell students do. And so they have their interests that they're really focused on. So, for example, in my world, in the emergency management and helping the city of Moore rebuild their communities after this tornado, HUD, as a condition of receiving the Community Development Block Grant funds to rebuild, says you must engage, you must develop a citizen participation plan, and it must do these certain things, and citizens have to be a part of the process. And so the city, last time I was in Oklahoma, the city held a meeting. Citizens came, And it was actually kind of fun for me to see that local process play out. I never got to see that before. That's what happens when you go to Washington. But I got to see it play out. And, you know, regular people raise their hand and stand up and raise their concerns. And their concerns are usually quite parochial. You know, well, okay, I see the map and where you're going to implement, you know, where you're going to build this new project. It's a housing project, but, you know, it's going to be mixed use. Housing project was great by design. But this one person, at least, and it was true for a number of others, was more concerned about, is that going to block the north-south street that I use every day to go to work and come home? He's more worried about, this guy was more worried about, you know, how long are you going to be engaging in this and blocking my street? All right? So part of the challenge of citizen participation is getting through all of that and getting some good examples and getting good advice and good suggestions that might be taken. And I think too often the government employees that have to translate those comments into useful additions to the program, you know, are pretty jaded about what they're going to get and treat it as a pro forma exercise. So I think the better examples are the ones that take citizen participation seriously, find means, technological or otherwise, to sort of work through, you know, separate the wheat from the chaff and get the good stuff, and incorporate the good stuff, so that, you know, when the program comes out and goes live, you know, the citizens out there can actually see, wow, that was my idea. It worked. And there are times I've seen at the local level where it can, but it's darn hard. And the grumpiness of the civil servants, frankly, have to be you have to bring them to the place where these are useful comments, figure out a way to incorporate them into the design of the program.
Alvaro?
Yes, thank you very much. My question was related to the point of citizen participation, since we are in the Maxwell School of Citizens and Public Affairs.
Absolutely.
One of the few schools with the word citizen there. So you addressed some of those points already, Dr. Blanchard, but now that Professor John mentioned the role of lobbying and the revolving door in these kind of issues, and perhaps the importance of citizens oversight and taxpayers' money, who are the champions that can bring the citizens into this debate, and how it will be from an organizational perspective? Do you think that it will require a policy perspective or enabling legislation to do that? And if so, as you already discussed about the incentives, who has the incentives or the disincentives of involving citizen oversight, in particular complex contracting public and private partnerships?
Ann, you want to start that?
Yeah, no, to me, it speaks to, in part, the issue of transparency, right, in what we do, and making it transparent to the public, right? And there are certainly a lot of shortcomings in the federal contracting space, but among our colleagues around the globe, we are considered one of the more transparent federal marketplaces, right? Public procurement marketplaces. And so, you know, we post solicitations for the public to see. We have USA spending, which you can track dollars, grant dollars, and procurement dollars, and where they're awarded. I think the challenge for us in making information accessible to the public and therefore able to get meaningful input back is the quality of our data, right? Right now, I think we've got two challenges, at least two. One is we have lots of different systems. So while this information is very transparent, it's spread through many, many, many different systems. So you can go to 40 different systems and get a little piece of the story, right? I think the other challenge is that our data, we don't have consistent data standards across government. So it's very easy for someone to see, it's very difficult for someone to see sort of the full picture, tracking a dollar, for example, from contract award to when it's actually obligated or spent. And so for me, when you talk about sort of citizen participation, it begins with just making the information, everything from A to Z in procurement, accessible to the public. And then I think the second issue is sort of how do you best engage the public? And for us, given just the vast size, I think it's best done online through feedback, and we post our comments on GitHub. I don't really even know what that is, but other people do. And
Software development.
oh, there we go. I was, by the way, I was one of the, you mentioned one of my awards was the top 50 women in IT in DC, and I was like, how did I win that? And I guess it's because I've been talking about IT acquisitions, but I'm stronger on the acquisition piece. But, and so for us, it's just such a vast space that I tend to kind of get my public input through organized groups like Stan's former group. But when possible, we put things out for public comment.
So I think it's a great question you raise, but again, sort of like the earlier discussion, it has multiple layers. There's no one answer because in each area I'm looking at, I may need, want, or benefit from different kinds of citizen input. Mm-hmm. So clearly transparency and huge levels of transparency are critically important because ultimately one big piece of it is confidence in the system.
Right. And
confidence is often, at least starts with transparency. When I'm looking at what of the government's functions are appropriate for contracting or not, I was at this thing I was talking about at Harvard Law School a few years ago, and this issue came up, and some folks administrative law professors, in fact, the guy who was the chair of the administrative law conference, was pushing this concept that every one of those decisions should be subjected to public comment, in the traditional ad law model. Well, aside from the fact that I didn't think it was necessary, you're talking about an unbelievably massive, you could never do it. But when I told him, and this gets the last part of my point here, when I said to him, you realize that every time an agency decides we're thinking of contracting out this function that is currently performed by a federal employee, they have to notify Congress. He said, oh, I didn't know that. I said, yeah. He says, okay, I feel better. My point being, Congress becomes the intermediary, right? So that's really where the system is structured, for Congress to be the representative of the voice and the executive executes. So when you talk about citizen input, I think Lloyd's examples are great at the local level where you're talking about housing and incarceration. Those, I don't minimize those, but you can't talk about it as a monolithic thing because it depends on where you're talking.
Good point.
And it's part and parcel of a broader sense of confidence in the government, which, as we know today, simply doesn't exist.
Well, thank you all very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. We're going to have a reception just down at the end of the hall in the Maxwell Eggers foyer. Please join us. Come and meet Ann and Stan and Lloyd there. And again, thank you so much for your participation.